For I happened on this sect myself, beloved, and was actually taught these things in person out of the mouths of people who really undertook them. Not only did women under this delusion offer me this line of talk and divulge this sort of thing to me with impudent boldness, moreover, they even tried to seduce me themselves, like that murderous, villainous Egyptian wife of the chief cook, because they wanted me in my youth. Now, the women who taught this dirty myth were very lovely in their outward appearance, but in their wicked minds, they had all the devil's ugliness. But the merciful God rescued me from their wickedness, so that after reading their books, understanding their real intent, and not being carried away with it, and after escaping without taking the bait, I lost no time reporting them to the bishops who were there and finding out which ones were hidden in the church. Thus, they were expelled from the city, about 80 persons, and the city was cleared of their tear-like thorny growth. Epiphanius. And then he continues to say, and so, with the women's emission, when she happens to have been on her period, they likewise take the unclean menstrual blood they gather from her and eat it in common. And this, they say, is the blood of Christ. And so, when they read, I saw a tree bearing 12 manner of fruits every year. And he said unto me, this is the tree of life. In the apocryphal writings, they interpret this allegorically as menstrual fluids. We are going to get back to this after the intro. Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm joined by Vivian Taylor. Links in the description. Follow her on Twitter, or X, I guess you call it. But you've been on my show. You know the deal. People know you already, especially people who've been here been here since the beginning. They know who you are. We come in, we dig right into the text. We don't waste any time. No bullshit. And today we're getting into exactly what the title says. We're getting into the dirty, dirty, dirty sources, those dirty heretics, and what were they doing? And let's try to pick apart. Is this slander? What's going on here? Is this really what the Christians were doing? Let's get into this stuff. So yeah, how's it going?
Hey, it's going really well. I'm excited to be here tonight. We're talking about one of my favorite, let's just call it weird parts of studying the history of Judaism, Christianity, and Gnosticism. And, I know for some folks, this might be a little weird. This might even Epiphanius says, well, I should be careful talking to this, as this is the sort of thing that might work sinners up. Might get people a little too excited.
I was feeling the Holy Spirit just reading that text right there.
Well, you got to be careful, according to these Gnostics, like old John the Baptist, sometimes he'd get a wind from the Holy Spirit and he'd preach Jesus, and sometimes he'd get a wind from the other spirits and
from the devil, right?
So let's be careful. But I think fundamentally what we're here to talk about is what is going on with the weird sects, cults in early Christianity that are often Gnostic. Because there are a couple of these. There's the Nassenes, there's the Borborites, but even as early as the New Testament writings in places like Romans chapter 1 and 1 Corinthians, it seems like there is weird sect stuff going on within some communities in early Christianity. Right. And it seems like these continued for centuries with the Borborites, who we're going to talk about tonight, existing as late as the 4th century. And I know one of the big questions is, where in the world does all this stuff come from? I mean, we're going to get into, so some of what you might call the vulgar details, but I think you'll see it's all surprisingly connected.
By the way, I see there's a super chat already, and thank you for that, Constellation Pegasus. We will get to super chats after we sort of lay down some of these sources. That way, just in case somebody drops a super chat, that we might be getting to that anyway. But yeah, just since it's already up there, I might as well just knock it out because it's just a simple question. Were the Borborites a nasty Gnostic group? Saw a video about them. That is what we're about to answer right now. So I might as well just bring it up and say, hey, stay tuned because we're going to answer that question for you.
Yeah.
You brought some sources. I brought some sources. We're going to do some cross-referencing. Well, let's take it away.
All right. Well, to understand what's going on in 4th century Christianity, of course, you have to go back in time a little bit. And in this case specifically, I think we got to go all the way back to the book of 2 Kings, chapter 23, verse 7. Now, what is special about chapter 23 of 2 Kings? This is one of the only places in the Hebrew Bible where there is a pretty clear reference to there being temple prostitutes or sacred prostitutes within the temple in Jerusalem. They're mentioned here in the context of King Josiah's reforms. So what the text says essentially is that the king, that there were women there weaving for the Asherah, and the king ordered that this be taken away, that this be gotten rid of. And now there are a lot of different arguments about exactly what's going on here. There are arguments about, like, what is an Asherah? Is this an idol of a goddess? Can you highlight verse 7 for me?
Yes, I can. Right here.
He tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple of the Lord, and the quarters where the women did weaving for Asherah. So, is Asherah just a big pole, like an image of a sacred grove? We certainly see sacred groves.
That weaving, if you don't mind, just be real quick. That weaving is very common with Aphrodite. Weaving.
Absolutely. Specifically, the concept of women's weaving in the Near East and the ancient world. This is very strongly associated with women, but also specifically women's sexuality. There are places where sex workers are sort of colloquially or, sort of euphemistically are described as weaving, as sewing women, that sort of thing. So it seems here that this was a place where there was some sort of prostitution going on within the church itself, and that it was somehow associated with the ancient Israelite polytheistic system of beliefs rather than the more strictly monotheistic Israelite beliefs that sort of grew into Second Temple Judaism.
The tradition that we all know.
Yeah, the one that we're kind of more familiar with and that we often kind of assume is like just the way it was forever, despite all the evidence making it seem like
the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like pre-exile within the Israelite community, there was a belief in a lot of gods, and sort of in the Hebrew Bible itself, this is framed as sort of imports from, the king's foreign wives, from the foreigners living around Israel. But it also just seems like more or less this was a part of the religion. And we can see things like this in the Elephantine papyri.
Yes. This is such a great point, because you can see the continuation of that culture all the way down in Egypt as they they flee the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians. And so through the Persian period, you see this sort of similar type of polytheistic, whatever you want to call that, worship deities. But there's also Yahoo is also the main deity at the temple.
Absolutely.
So there are Yahwists, and that is sort of the main culture,
Absolutely. And like what we see even from the Elephantine Papyri, they are literally letters being written to communities in Jerusalem and communities in Samaria, asking for money to help rebuild and repair their temple after an anti-Semitic riot, which, 2,400 years ago.
Nothing's changed, has it?
Yeah, we live in a complex world, but also, as the book of Ecclesiastes says, there's nothing new under the sun.
Sure.
But, and of course there are arguments, but at the temple at Elephantine, Yahweh is worshipped with his two wives, and one of whom, is Asherah, and the other one is the Egyptian goddess Anat. And, there are arguments, are these separate deities, or these hypostases of Yahweh? Who can say exactly?
Right. And you could say that about a lot of different regions and local, local cults have a lot of similar things like that. For example, you see in Ephesus, you'll see Artemis, and she gets blended in with other goddesses that look a lot like something like Athena or whatever. They call her Bendis. Not Athena's the Athenian goddess, but there's a goddess named Bendis in that region who gets. It's like, is it a different god than Artemis, or is it some sort of different form of her? It's like who knows, right? Maybe both. So.
Yeah, and it's all tightly packed in together. The gods all sort of flow in and out of one another. So, in some ways, all the gods are one, all the gods are separate. But it definitely seems like when you get the more separate versions, when you get more thought about goddesses and independent figures in the ancient world, there's more likely to be systems of worship around them that sometimes involve some sort of sacred sex. This can come in different forms. In some places, it seems like what Herodotus talks about. And of course, is Herodotus like a perfect 21st century historian who gets everything right? Look, I won't.
Not Thucydides, let's say that. Thucydides is a lot more careful.
Look, I would love it if there were giant ants that you could train to mine gold for you.
What about the gold guarding griffins in Scythia? Don't forget about those.
Yeah, no, I need a gold guarding griffin.
You wouldn't need banks if you had those.
Well, unless Wells Fargo tries to just take money out of my checking account again, then I can stick the griffin on them.
Right.
But what Herodotus talks about sacred prostitution is, and there's some other evidence of these forms, like there's some sort of rite that some authors have sort of compared to what eventually becomes the bar mitzvah, like sort of a puberty rite, an entrance to adulthood rite, where young women go to a temple of a goddess. They are there until someone gives them money. The more money, the better. The more money they go home with, they're more marriageable, and they have sex for money at the temple this one time, and it's some sort of initiation. There's also examples like what you see in Lucian's The Syrian Goddess, which is more, is probably a little more closely related to Israelite religion, as it's also a Semitic society with a Semitic deity, Magna Mater, the giant black stone. And in this, you can get stranger things. You have, and even what it mentions in Second Kings, with the male prostitutes. You get these ideas of these effeminate male prostitutes, effeminate figures, sometimes castrated, sometimes not, but also women. And it seems like for some, the temple prostitution thing is a more long-term kind of setup where it's just a part of the space. The third example that a lot of that there's some scholarship on is just because in a lot of cities, and this continued, in some ways until the modern day, but at least until like the 1500s in Europe, you saw this. Like for a lot of cities, the temple, the church, whatever, is the main central element of the city. Everything is kind of built around it as the most infrastructure. So it may also just be that when you have, an ancient city, there's not much to do. There's not a lot of places to go. And since the temple then becomes kind of the key space within the city, that's just also where the prostitutes are working, the sex workers are working, are, meeting clients, turning tricks, etc. So there's kind of three different things that could be going on here, and it's not entirely sure which. Maybe it's a one-time passing through ritual. Maybe it's a longer term like function where there's some sort of mysticism attached to the ongoing, sort of living vocationally as a temple prostitute. Or maybe because the temple is just the central institution in the city, this is where the sex workers are doing their thing. So because Second Kings doesn't go into a lot of detail about like the economics and self-understanding of the male prostitutes and the Asherah weavers, we don't know exactly, but there was something there. And it seems like it was a fairly consistent part of culture that in the time of reforms were the same reforms that were also leading more towards monotheism, that there was a real suppression of temple prostitution within Israelite religion and later Judaism.
Right. By the way, I just want to, someone just dropped a huge super chat, and I really, really appreciate that. You did not have to do that, but you did. You know what? I'm suspending my Bible research. When I retire, I want to get a degree in particle physics. This research has been a roller coaster ride. Yes, it is. I admit that. I agree with that. I got to give you credit for looking into these rabbit holes. I salute you for your effort. Constellation Pegasus, I don't know what to say. Thank you. That is very nice of you. And words can't express it, but you didn't have to do that. And I really thank you for that. That's a very, very generous thing you just did there. I appreciate that.
Well, that's awesome. All right. So, part of these reforms is also, and you can see this in a lot of places in the Hebrew Bible, but it's moving from there being a lot of different places where rituals are being carried out. The Hebrew Bible often talks about the shrines in high places. We can see with the various temples in different places, with even the temple in Elephantine being a very good example of this. When you have, especially in the ancient world, these ritual and religious sites that are spread out high and yonder, then that creates room for a lot of different ways of practicing the religion, worshiping God or gods. And it makes it much harder to reform. So as the Jerusalem temple becomes the main temple, and especially after the exile, what we see in stuff like Ezra and Nehemiah with this really this really strong, strict centralization of religious authority at the temple in Jerusalem. Part of that,
they make a big deal out of that ceremony that you have your high priest, Zechariah, and then the new governor. They don't call him a king because it's not a king. You can't do that. For some reason, you can't have a king yet.
Well, there's only one king of
but he's
kings.
related. They say he's related to David. You know, they say he's a Davidic line. His name is Zerubbabel, and they make this big deal out of this ceremony. Make 2 crowns, 1 silver, 1 gold, and put the one on Zerubbabel and put the one on the high priest. And they anoint each. That's the high priest that anoints the king, and it's like, whoa, this is a big deal. They got their temple back. There's just there's some. The text wants to make you think it happened exactly, I think 70 years. But if you look at the actual evidence, I was talking to Gad Barnett about this. It's not. It's a little bit later than that. But like, hey, we're close enough, right? Like, we fit. It's like, you gotta admit, it's kind of funny.
Absolutely. Like, history is messy. History is always going to be messy. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about. But I think one important point is that as the Jerusalem temple becomes the central location, that centralizing is wrapped up in these other reforms. I mean, and it's so funny that this, by the way, that this governor descended from David. I mean, he doesn't even have a Yahweh theonym.
Right.
A theonym is the name of a god in his name. He has Baal in his name, who
it does. Yeah, it is interesting. Now, I heard people say his name breaks down to Zoru, which is like seated, and then Babel, which is Babylon. But you might be right. There might be that Baal in there. It might be Lord, because we're talking about a different period of time when Baal was still prominent in these religious circles. So what you're saying, what I'm saying could be just folk etymology and trying to match up. Oh, he came from the east. He's seated in Babylon. Like, you know what I mean? So for all we know, who knows? Even if his name might have been something completely different, we don't know. We really don't know.
I'll admit, for tonight, I did not go deep on Zerubbabel.
Yeah.
In the past, I have read that he has Baal as his theonym in there.
I wouldn't doubt that at all.
And even that can be a sign of sort of this ongoing process of reform, where you're getting rid of the worship of Baal, you're getting rid of the worship of Astarte, you're getting rid of the worship of all these other gods that are around, and you're saying we're only going to worship the one God, Yahweh. We're only going to worship at the one temple in Jerusalem, and we're only going to worship in the one manner as prescribed by the Torah, which also, if you read in 2 Kings, is like found in the back, basically, when they start working on it, and everyone's like, oh, I guess we should start getting back into this. And so you have sort of, and I'm going to use some Christian words, but you have orthopraxy. You have this same practice at the one place under the one rule, and in some ways that's a very nice box. And that seems to have been pretty effective from what I've read at banning temple prostitution and really driving temple prostitution underground. So this goes on, and and there's lots of fighting. There's like the Maccabees reconsecrate the temple. There's the Greeks coming in and doing stuff. Eventually the Romans, etc., etc. And then we get a carpenter from Nazareth named Jesus, who has some funny ideas about how we should all sell all our property and give the money to the poor and live in a community together. I mean, real hippie stuff.
Right.
So Jesus, he gets in the way of people making money.
He's a lot like a Jewish version of Diogenes the Cynic.
I think that
he was very much like, screw, who cares about material wealth? More like he lived in a jar in the city and just washed his fruit in the stream of Athens and water. And it's like, kind of, Jesus sort of has a very cynic approach, a very cynic attitude. Even the way he talks to people, very cynic. A lot of cynic. There's like a cynic layer there. That's what I meant. Yeah. Yeah.
My favorite Diogenes story is when he's going around in the daylight with a lantern on a stick, and he's going up close to people and getting their space. And finally, somebody just asks him, it's like, Diogenes, you asshole, what are you doing? You know what he says?
I think looking for the good man or something like that.
Looking for an honest man.
Honest man, yeah. I like that's funny. Yeah, there's a lot of funny stories like that with him. He's a legend, and the fact that he lived the same time as Plato and they hated each other and they just kept talking shit about each other. I love it. It's awesome. He's like the anti-Plato.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I would have to look at him more in opposition to Plato.
There's a story where he confronts Plato. Well, this actually happens a lot, where one of the times he confronts Plato, he's talking shit about Plato sucking up to the tyrant of Sicily, Dionysius. He's like, how is it kissing ass for the tyrant? Ha ha, I'm free. I don't have to do that. And he's like, well, at least I don't have to wash my vegetables in the stream. And he's like, at least I don't have to kiss ass to get vegetables. Like, he's like, they're like talking shit to each other. And there's another story about them talking shit to each other where Diogenes is watching Plato do a speech or a lesson or something. And when Plato was like comparing the human body anatomy to a chicken, I think it was chicken or a rooster or something, bipedal. Diogenes grabs a chicken and brings it in front of the whole class and goes, look, here's Plato's man. And the whole class started laughing. Plato's like, hey, that was mean. Like, just like hearing stories like that, if they're true or not, who knows? But it might reflect their personalities, their philosophies, and there might be some layer of truth to like their ideas. You know what I mean?
Sure. And I think that this is important for understanding what we're talking about tonight, because I think for a lot of people, sort of that knee-jerk, anti-authoritarian, fuck the powers, I won't do what you tell me, who is this guy trying to tell me that he has wisdom kind of thing.
Right.
Like, I think for a lot of people, that kind of feels hyper-modern. Like, we were the first people to ever think about mistrusting authority and thinking that a lot of like proud and self-righteous people are kind of full of shit. It turns out that they heard about that 3,000 years ago.
Right.
And so one of the big things that you see with Jesus and is a certain level of tension with this heavy-handed unifying tradition that has led to like one belief in the one temple, in the one city, and we're just going to do it here. And so, Jesus knocks over the tables, gets in trouble with the money changers, gets in trouble with the police, says stuff like, well, anyone who is calls himself a king is no friend of the emperor, that sort of thing. He gets in trouble. The police arrest him. They nail him to a piece of wood. He dies. But then after he dies, all these people come to believe that he has come back, and through coming back has saved their...
Definitely left a mark, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, it seems like a lot of people believed it and believe it to this day.
Sure.
So, but one of the big things we see, and I'm sure that a lot of y'all are very aware of this, you get the split between the Christians who want...
Diogenes defaced currency. I didn't mean to...
That's hilarious. I didn't know that, but hey, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, I guess, or whoever was ruling Athens at the time. But so in early Christianity, one of the first big splits you get the followers of Jesus's brother James, who are a little less big on Jesus as a cosmic figure. A little more big on the idea that a very big focus on the intentional poverty, on the selling everything you have and living in community with others without property. This group becomes known as the Poor of Jerusalem. They're sort of a begging order, what's sometimes called a mendicant order, but they are very focused on the continuing Judaism of Christianity. Their descendants eventually go on to be known as the Ebionites. who like believe Jesus is human,
Yeah.
that
And
may
they don't
have
like
gone.
Paul, according to I think Hippolytus or Irenaeus, one of those texts says they don't like Paul.
Oh no. Back then, I mean, you can see it in the book of Galatians, earliest book in the New Testament. It's about this fight between Paul, who very strongly believes that non-Jewish people can be Christians just by believing in Jesus, and one of the big things is he doesn't think that Christians need to be circumcised, but then that circumcision is itself standing in for following the Jewish law strictly. Whereas it seems strongly like James, the brother of Jesus, said, we have to still follow the law. So
Right.
what we see in the book of Galatians and in the book of Acts, and of course, there are questions, but it seems like you have the more law-following folks more or less stay in Jerusalem around James. But then Paul is going all over as a missionary. He's also sending other people as missionaries. And they're building these Christian communities among Gentile populations all over the place.
Yeah.
Going
and,
into them.
And by the way, at that time, a lot of people don't realize this, but there already were very Hellenistic, law-ignoring Jewish communities all over those cities. So it wasn't like Paul had his hands tied, like he had to go to all these completely pagan communities that had no idea what Judaism was. They were already like, they're called themselves Hypsisterians in some of these circles, worshipers of God Most High. They're still Gentiles, but they're also like, we're like reading some Septuagint texts and stuff. Like, so that Paul was already going out to a market of people who were more inclined than people would think. That's what I'm saying. By the way, Constellation Pegasus, another $50. What are you doing? I hope I'm not killing you over there, because you don't have to do this. Thank you, though. I really appreciate it. That is very, very kind of you. It's interesting how the Hebrews worshiping Baal in isolated groups in the so-called wilderness after seeing an Egyptian army destroyed. Evidence their God was real, then even getting more stupid, making a golden calf. Something went wrong with this story. Yeah, it's interesting. It makes you think it's not real. I don't think that whoever wrote this is like writing this as a historical narrative. I think it represents, look, they're still doing these rites. Moses is coming down with the law. It's supposed to be like the law versus the old ways, maybe type of some sort of like scene where they're worshiping a golden calf, but Moses is coming down with the new law, that type of thing.
So that actually plays in what we're talking about here. Right. There's some good scholarship that suggests that the golden calf story is itself about this fight over the Jerusalem temple, supposed to be like the central one place where you worship. So one of the big splits in the Israelite religion was between the Jews and the Samaritans. And I'll just point out, Jesus never uses the term Good Samaritan in the New Testament. That's a name put on this story. Like the Samaritans and the Jews, it seems like in first century,
right,
still very much like they understood that like we're all Israelites. We have some different beliefs, but we're all Israelites. The Samaritans believed, and there's some evidence to suggest they may have even like been the older form of the religion to some degree, but they believed that the temple was supposed to be on Mount Gerizim instead of Jerusalem. And in the Hebrew Bible, there's a story of how Solomon and Solomon's son Rehoboam calls in real trouble. And so a Samaritan general breaks away and goes down and founds a separate kingdom, breaking away the 10 northern tribes as opposed to the 2 southern tribes. And when the Samaritan king sets it up, he sets up 2 golden calves at the temple at Mount Gerizim and says, oh, these are your gods who brought you out of Egypt. So there is some scholarly thinking that the golden calf in the Exodus story is about sort of shaming the Samaritan style of worship and is more focusing on that narrative that, as I said, there is one specific way that you are supposed to worship God. There is one specific place where you are supposed to worship God. And there is one specific group of leaders who you're supposed to listen to about everything vis-a-vis worshiping God. So basically, they don't want there to be a separate temple on Mount Gerizim. They don't want there to be a separate path to Yahweh that is not through the Jerusalem temple. So it's all connected. It's all about centralization. And
Critical.
we're about to talk about, well, what are the good things about centralization? Like, it's easy to be cynical and say, hey, I'm an American. What do I care if people want to have their own temple on this mountain, that mountain, or some mountain I've never seen before? Well, one of the things that we see very early on in the New Testament, both in the book of Romans and in the book of 1 Corinthians. So in the Christian community, Paul is writing these letters to the Christian communities in Rome and Corinth. And in both cases, once you start dispersing worship of Yahweh, which Christianity fundamentally is still a part of, from the temple, from a specific set of authorities, it seems like you are having the reappearance of religious sexual practices that in some ways mirror the temple prostitution that was outlawed in 2 Kings, that was banned in 2 Kings. Like, the first chapter of Romans, if you grew up Southern Baptist like me, you may have heard this used to hammer gay and lesbian people. But if you look at it, it very much seems to be Paul warning against and condemning the use of temple prostitution in Rome, which admittedly probably often would have used young boys as temple prostitutes. And so it seems like if Paul is having to write this condemning Christians and very early Christians, this is within a decade or two of the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth, but Paul's having to condemn Christians for participating in these kinds of temple prostitution, which itself seems to be, or at least according to some scholars, very similar to temple prostitution relating to Aphrodite that we see in other places. So you have the reemergence of some level of comfort with goddesses within this system, and with spirituality and mysticism relating to goddesses, leading to temple prostitution. So you start seeing these things very, very early on in Christianity. And I think, as we've talked about in some previous videos where I was on here, I think it's important to remember that Gnosticism is not like Judaism's here, Christianity's here, and like Gnosticism's here, and they're like three separate.
That's one of the things that I was talking to Gad Barnea about on that episode that's going to be coming out probably either in the next day or two. It's almost finished. And he says Yahwism, what we call Gnosticism, is just another offshoot of Yahwism.
Absolutely.
It doesn't deserve its own special category of heresy. It's just coming from the same roots, which is for the same tree, just branching off in another direction.
Absolutely.
They all have their own arguments of why they're right. It just happens to be that this particular Greek sect in Nicaea ended up getting all the power. It's just the way it is. Like, just naturally happened that way. There could have been a million different scenarios that could have happened.
Yeah, and I do think that one of the reasons, like the sort of Nicene form of Christianity that became Eastern Orthodoxy, which kind of gave us Christianity as we know it in the modern world. One of the reasons it succeeded was because it was always the most popular. So it's also just kind of, the biggest one, as is so often the case. Well,
Oh, I just wanted to show. You can keep talking, but I was just going to say when you were done, this verse right here, 1 Kings, is acknowledging Solomon being a worshiper of Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable. So whatever. Like there was even in the later accounts that are, I don't know how you would tradition, even like the later traditions as we're seeing here in Kings are even acknowledged. There's like basically what it's like. They're acknowledging this was part of their tradition. Does that make sense?
absolutely. And of course, but you can also see in this verse, Ashtaroth, she's the goddess of the Sidonians.
Right.
This is a foreign.
Yeah, they're trying to make it see. Yeah, exactly. It can't be them, right? It's got to be outsider. It's got to be bad. It's got to be testable, something. But I think it does acknowledge. I think at the very least, the text acknowledges like it was present. You know what I mean? Because Solomon is the son of David. He's one of the most important figures in the early first temple. He's the first temple builder. So it's like, yeah, it's fascinating that they would write that in there like that. I think.
Yeah, I mean, Solomon is very much a
prototype.
Well, I was gonna say more of a Tony Soprano type.
Oh,
like even in the Bible, Solomon is like murdering people and getting into trouble, and he has all the wisdom, and he has all the wisdom. He has a level of access to wisdom which, in many traditions, no one else has had before or since. And also importantly, with Gnosticism, as Epiphanius says, a lot of the traditions about controlling demons and spirits and lesser gods, and that almost all goes back to Solomonic magic.
Right.
And so this idea that
the tradition is accredited to him because there's a reason, there's a legitimate reason why it's like that,
Yeah, and if you look much of the magical tradition, like the amulets and stuff that we've found in archaeology, Solomon's magic is referenced all the way back. Some of the earliest amulets we have are talking about Solomon. So this
the Pythagoreans were into all the same sort of symbolisms with this pointed stars, the 8-pointed stars, the 6-pointed stars, and they all meant different things. They all were attributed to different gods, different magical meanings behind them. You find that in those texts a lot too. Yeah. And the Star of David is one of those symbols that you see in the Pythagorean text as well.
Sure. And if you get into the Greek magical papyri, there is very liberal mixing of Solomonic magic and Pythagoras stuff. I mean, these folks were drawing from any and everywhere. And you can see that in a lot of these texts that we're dealing. Like Epiphanius, he mentions that this Gnostic group, the Borborites,
which I brought text for. Yeah,
we're gonna get into it.
Yeah.
So one of the things he mentions is that they believe that the god of this world, the creator god, has the head of an ass. So this is a connection into into this whole system where after Hellenism came, basically everybody's reading and writing in Greek. In 3rd century Egypt, which is under Greek rule, there started to be Jewish celebrations and even theatrical productions based on the Exodus story. And it's all in Greek. People in Egypt get upset because of how the Egyptians are framed as the bad guys. And, it's the worst thing you can imagine in that period in Egyptian culture, to be drowned in the sea. So his horse and his rider have been thrown into the sea. It upsets people. And so there's this whole tradition of connecting Seth, who is also connected with the Greek Typhon, the big snake monster, has that
desert god too.
Yeah.
Which is them wandering in the desert, right? They left Egypt, they're wandering in the desert. What god's going to save them? Oh, exactly. It must have been Seth. They're just looking at the cosmology of the time and putting two and two together. So yeah, there is some, by the way, Tacitus, and I mentioned this on my channel many, many times, but just in case someone might be watching this for the first time or something, I got to share this. So Tacitus tells us a story. This is late first, early second century, early second century, where he says that the Jews, when they got kicked out of Egypt, he doesn't say this happened in the Bronze Age, by the way. He dates this to the time of King Bocchus, which is like 8th century BC. So what the hell? The Exodus happened in the 8th century BC? Where did that come from, right? No one thought that, but that's what Tacitus thought. So I don't know what sources he has. Some people think he's getting this from Hecataeus of Abdera, which is a source that we've lost. Could be true. But anyways, it says that the Oracle of Ammon told them that they had to get out because their detestable worship is causing all these plagues and stuff. Anyways, to make a long story short, here's what happens though. Moses followed so Moses is leading them in the desert, right? And it says, nothing caused them so much distress as scarcity of water. In fact, they had already fallen exhausted over the plain nigh unto death when a herd of wild asses, wild donkeys, moved from their pasturage to a rock that was shaded by a grove of trees. Moses followed them, and conjecturing the truth from the grassy ground, discovered an abundant streams of water. This relieved them, and then they marched 6 days continuously, and on the 7th day seized a country, expelling the former inhabitants there. They founded a city and dedicated a temple. But then it says right here, Moses introduced new religious practices quite opposed to all the other religions. They regard profane that we hold sacred. They dedicated a shrine in the statue of the creature, the ass, the donkey, who guided them and enabled them to put an end to their wandering of thirst. And then they sacrificed the ram to get at Ammon. So yes, there is a tradition. There is this idea that they have a god who's a donkey-headed god. And there's even more sources than this. There's a Gnostic text. I think you were going to talk about that one, right? The Gnostic one?
Yeah.
The one that says that the father of John the Baptist, Zechariah, went into the temple before he has his son. He goes into the temple and he lights the incense, and then the donkey-headed god appears to him and just says, "Don't tell anybody who I am." And then he makes him mute, which, by the way, that's in the Gospel of Luke. I think he becomes mute in that story, but that doesn't have that part. But in this version, it's because of this donkey-headed god. And this is a Sethian text. The Sethians, Set, you know what I mean? So yeah, there is some there. And one last thing too. This is another thing I mentioned on my channel. I'm David Litwell on talking about this. He wrote a whole book about this. There's another source from a guy named Menasius who says that when Antiochus the fourth raided the temple, he found a donkey, a statue of a guy riding a donkey. So there's like, okay, now we have a bunch of different sources that are sort of like pointing to something similar going on. Fascinating.
Yep. So a lot of the Gnostics do latch on to this, where Yahweh is connected with the Egyptian Seth and the Greek Typhon. You have this sort of Yahweh, Seth, Typhon monster deity. And that's, according to the Gnostics, at least, sort of the Hebrew Bible God, also the creator of the physical world. This is a way that as Christians are separating themselves from Judaism and in some ways engaging in more and more anti-Semitism. You see more and more of these narratives develop within Gnosticism. And so you get some what I like to call weird math coming out of, well, if the creator God is bad and we sort of have some memory of these older traditions within Israelite religion about like goddesses and that kind of wisdom tradition concerning goddesses, and like maybe if you dig in enough, sort of the sacred prostitution, temple prostitution stuff bubbles up in that. And so you can say, well, if we were told by the people following the bad God that we're not supposed to do these things, maybe
we should do these things.
good for us to do the things that have been banned.
By the way, a lot of those people are following Plato because which one was it? I think it's Valentinus or no, not Valentinus. But there's an argument from one of these followers of the gospel called the Apocryphon of John when they're talking about Yaldabaoth, and he says, if the demiurge is all good and can't be jealous, which is a reference to Plato's Timaeus. So Plato says the demiurge is all perfect and can't be jealous of anything. So they're saying, if that's true, then that means this God who says he's jealous, I'm a jealous God, must not be the real creator. He must be an imposter. So there's that little bad math thing you're talking about. You can see how they're coming up with these ideas, though. Another one was the Cainites. The Cainites, they decided that Cain had to have been good and Abel had to have been evil. Why? Because they're a bunch of Pythagorean vegetarians. They're following Pythagoras. Pythagoras was like, don't eat meat, eat vegetables, be peaceful. And they're like, well, Abel's offering up meats, and Cain is a tiller of the land. So wait a minute, he's the good one. Abel's the bad one, and they call themselves the Cainites. So this is like, it's cool. That's a good way to put it. It's like math. They're doing math in their head, you know.
Well, but as time goes on, you get a lot of Gnostic sects, but these Gnostic groups are often more within the larger Christian community. And you can see that in Epiphanius, like at the quote read at the beginning of the episode, where after they tried to get Epiphanius into a sex cult, he runs to the bishops and he's like, help! And right. 80 of these people get kicked out of the city.
Do you think now is an appropriate time to go through some of the stuff he says about these Borborites? Okay.
And we can also, there's also another good text that I think could be helpful called the Paraphrase of Shem.
I had that here, so I'll pull that up next. By the way, real quick, before I read this, you guys, this is going to blow your minds. Blow your minds what I'm about to read you. Constellation Pegasus drops another one. He said, okay, hopefully this is your last one. You said the last point. Thank you. I really, really, really like. I don't know how I can thank you enough but thank you. But you really don't have to drop any more like this. Please buy your family something, get some food, or please. Thank you, though. One last point on how brainwashed we all are. The suffering servant is positively identified as being IL. There is no doubt or argument about it. It's truly amazing how we didn't see that before the researching. Kind of embarrassing, actually. Being identified as... I'm not sure I grasp what you mean there. One last point on how brainwashed we are. The suffering servant is positively identified as... Oh, Israel!
Yeah.
Oh! I didn't know anything about IL. Yeah, this is something me and the Rabbi Tobias Singer are talking about. It says the suffering servant is the nation of Israel. Yeah, good point. Really good point. Thanks for that super chat. So I have the Paraphrase of Shem, and we're going to go to that right after this. So I already read this in the beginning of the show. And I'm just going to rephrase this real quick, where Epiphanius tells you this little story of a first-hand account, according to himself, that he was approached by these Borborites who are doing these wicked acts. And what are these wicked acts? Well, let's read what Epiphanius says about them. So I'm just going to read. This is all good stuff. So just buckle up and listen. Grab yourself a tea. Take a listen along as I read you this phenomenal source right here. He says, Nicholas was one of the 7 deacons chosen by the apostles, together with the saint and first martyr Stephen. So we're talking about 1st century, 40s AD. One of the first chosen deacons. This guy, that's this big heretic. What? And he says, Prochorus and Parmenius and all the others. He was from Antioch, and he became a proselyte, an elder. But after that, he received, so that means he was around for a while, by the way. That's what that indicates. He was around for a while. This guy's chosen by the apostles. He's around for a while. He becomes an elder. All right, what did he do? But after that, he received the message of the proclamation of Christ, joined the disciples himself, and was the first ranked among the foremost. He was thus included among the ones who were chosen at the time to care for the widows. Later, however, the devil slipped into him and deceived his heart with the same imposture of the ancients, just like we were talking about, the ancient rites of Aphrodite and Dionysus. But let's continue. Hold that thought. The same imposture of the ancients whom we have been discussing, so that he was more severely wounded than the ones before him. Though he had a beautiful wife, he had I'm actually going to skip this part. He's basically saying, he's not good. He's not a good husband, but it's not really, I got to skip this part because I want to get to the part. I don't want to read the whole thing. I don't want to take too long. This is what he says, though. You can read that for yourself, pause it, read it for yourself, but I got to, just to get through this. He says, and from this source, the founders, what is falsely termed in the Greek, it says gnosis, but here it says knowledge, began their evil sprouting in the world. I mean, the people who are called Gnostics, Vivianites, the so-called disciples of Epiphanes, the Stratiotics, the Levitics, the Borborites, and the rest, each of whom of these, in attracting his own sect and passions, invented countless ways of doing evil. And he basically talks about they glorify this god named Barbello, who's the highest god, blah, 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 blah. But here's where shit gets crazy. Ready for this? For the sake of their lustfulness, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. This is not all in order, but I'm going in chronological order, but I'm skipping through just all the good parts. For the sake of their lustfulness, they have destroyed and are destroying both themselves and whomever they can convince. For there is a spirit of imposture, which, like a breath in a flute, sets every fool, think of Pan when you hear the flute, sets every fool in motion against the truth with its various movements. Indeed, the flute itself is a replica of the serpent through which evil one spoke and deceived Eve. For the flute was prepared to deceive mankind on its model and imitation of it. And we see what the flutist himself represents as he plays his flute. He throws his head back and he plays and bends it forward. He leans right and leans left like a serpent. For the devil makes these gestures too, to display blasphemy of the heavenly host and to destroy earth's creatures utterly, while at the same time getting the world into his toils, wreaking havoc right and left on those who trust in posture and are charmed by it as by the notes of an instrument. By the way, before I go to the next verse, I just want to show you, this is Pan, everyone. Pan is a flute player. That's the devil. That's where we get the image of the devil from. That's Pan, baby. So he's just following the culture. He's just looking at it. Epiphanius ain't wrong here. It is kind of the devil's instrument. Anyways, the next one says Kaaba means fornication in Syriac, but murder in Hebrew. And again, it can be translated as a quarter of measure. And to persons who know this name in their own languages, something like this deserving of jeering and laughter, or rather of indignation. Then he says right here, this is where we get into Aphrodite. But to persuade us to have congress with bodies that perish and lose our heavenly hope, they present us with a shameful narrative by this wonderful prophet, quotes, and in turn, they are not above reciting the amatory exploits of Aphrodite's whoredom and so many words. Others of them, in their turn, introduce a fictitious work of pornography, a fabrication they have named by claiming that it is a gospel of perfection. And truly, this is not a gospel of perfection, but a dirge for it. All the perfection of death is contained in such a devil's sowing. I love the way this guy writes, Epiphanius. This is beautiful writing right here. I can only imagine how good the Greek probably sounds. Others are not ashamed to speak of a gospel of Eve, for they sow their stunted crop in her name, because supposedly she obtained the food of knowledge by revelation from the serpent which spoke to her. And as an inconstant state of mind, the utterances of a man who is drunk and babbling at random cannot be alike. But some are made with laughter, but others tearfully. The deceiver's sowing has come up to correspond with every sort of evil. They begin with foolish visions and proof texts in which they claim is a gospel. For they make this allegation: I stood upon a lofty mountain and saw a man who was tall, and another like of stature. And I heard, as it were, the sound of thunder, and drew nigh to hear. And he spake with me and said, I am thou, and thou art I. And wheresoever thou art, there am I. And I am sown in all things. And from wheresoever thou wilt, thou gatherest me. But in gathering me, thou gatherest thyself. He says, what a devil's sowing! How has he managed to divert the minds of mankind and distract them from telling of the truth to things that what are foolish and untenable? Now, I want to get to the next verse because this is where we talk about a gospel that they produce, these Borborites. They have their own gospel, believe it or not. And he says, but I shall get right down to the worst part of the deadly description of them, for they're very in their wicked teaching of what they please, which is, first of all, that they hold their wives in common. They're all polygamists. That's what he says. This is such a good description. I'm so glad we have Epiphanius. Anyways,
maybe it's more like a free love group than like polygamy, because everybody is getting with everybody, men and women together.
That's right. He actually does say that. Yeah. And if a guest who is their persuasion arise, they have a sign that men give women and women give men a tickling of the palm as they clasp hands in supposed greeting to show that the visitor is of their religion.
Just a little tickle, just one.
Right. And once they recognize each other from this, they start feasting right away. And they set the table with lavish provisions for eating meat and drinking wine, even if they are poor. But then after drinking bout and let us say stuffing their overstuffed veins, they get hot for each other that night. And the husband will move away from his wife and tell her, speaking to his own wife, get up, perform the agape with the brother. When the wretched couple has made love, and I am truly ashamed to mention the vile things they do, for as the holy apostle says, it is a shame even to speak of what goes on among them. Still, I should not be ashamed to say what they are not ashamed to do, to arouse horror by every means in those who hear what obscenities they are prepared to perform. For after having made love with the passion of fornication, in addition to lift their blasphemy up to heaven, the woman and man receive the man's admission on their own hands, and they stand with their eyes raised heavenward, but the filth on their hands, and pray, if you please, the ones they call Stratiatics and Gnostics, and offer that stuff on their hands to the true Father of all, and say, we offer this gift, the body of Christ. By the way, he's talking about semen, guys. And they eat it, partaking of their own dirt, and say, this is the body of Christ, and this is the Pascha, because of which our bodies suffer and are compelled to acknowledge the passion of Christ. It's not over yet, though. This is where we get into the... So that's what they're doing. They're doing a semen Eucharist. Here we go. Listen, there's 2 more slides I got to go through. This is all good stuff. And so, with the women's emission, and she happens to having her period, they likewise take the unclean menstrual blood, they gather from her, and eat it in common. And this, they say, is the blood of Christ. And so, when they read, I saw a tree bearing 12 manner of fruits every year. And he said unto me, this is the tree of life. In apocryphal writings, they interpret this allegorically of menstrual flux. And so then, okay, so I'm gonna skip ahead again. This is the last slide I got. You could pause that and read the rest of that if you'd like. But just to get through this, because that's a lot there, this is what he says about their gospel. He says, and they too have a lot of books. They publish certain questions of Mary. This is like a gospel text. It's called the Questions of Mary. But others offer many books about Yaldabaoth, we spoke of, in the name of Seth. There's the donkey god. They call others the apocalypses of Adam, and have ventured to compose other gospels in the names of disciples, and are not ashamed to say that our Savior and Lord himself, Jesus Christ, revealed this obscenity. So they're claiming that this came from Christ himself. These Borborites, who, by the way, are getting this from one of the original apostles. So their claim to fame is very strong, by the way. But all right, put that aside for now. We'll talk about that later. For in the so-called greater questions of Mary, there are also lesser ones forged by them. They claim that he reveals it to her after. So Jesus takes Mary on a mountain. All right, this is what it says. He reveals it to her after taking her aside on a mountain, praying, producing a woman from his side, beginning to have sex with her, and then partaking of his emission, his load, if you please, to show that thus we must do that we may live, Mary. Thus we must do that we may live, Mary. And when Mary was alarmed, fell to the ground, he raised her up and said to her, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Sounds like Jesus right there. That's very Jesus-y. They got the spirit down, that's for sure. They made it sound like Jesus, that's for sure. And they say that this is the meaning of the saying in the gospel. If I have told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall you believe in heavenly things? When you see the Son of Man ascending up where he was before. In other words, when you see the emission, the load being partaken of where it came from. And then Christ said, this is the caps it all off, except you eat my flesh and drink my blood. And the disciples were disturbed and replied, who can hear this? And they say his saying was about the dirt, the semen. Woo! That's a dirty gospel right there. Talk about a dirty gospel.
So
there's a lot to say about that.
Here.
We didn't even get to the psychedelic part yet. That's a whole other story. But let's stay on this for now.
There's also a thing, and it's okay if we don't go through the whole quote. It's kind of gross, where they're like, and if a woman accidentally does get pregnant through this, they'll give her an abortion, and then they will cook the fetus with spices, and they'll all eat the fetus.
That's in that text. And it's another paragraph. I just didn't screenshot that one, but that's what they said. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and the reason why is because they had that Gnostic understanding of the world being evil. The baby doesn't need to be born. We need to save that baby. Something like that, right?
Well, so let's talk about exactly what is going on here and what this means. Because I think, much like Mary in the story, this is a pretty fucked up thing to hear. Like, Jesus is making a woman out of it. I mean, look, it's one thing to say, oh, ye of little faith, when it's like, give your property away, love one another, love the, foreigners, carry
the load if you want to make it to the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah. That one, that's getting a little crazy. I mean, it's one thing for Jesus to be the second Adam. It's another thing for him to produce a woman out of his side and have sex with her and then eat his semen from having sex with the woman he created out of his own body. Like, that's pretty intense. But I do think that there is. So first, I think that there is some possibility that this didn't really happen, and the more extreme parts are
Epiphanius talking crap.
Maybe.
I think there's some truth to that. Now, I'm not saying that these Borborites probably. I'm open to them being very spiritual, Bacchic revelry type of deal, but I think Epiphanius is trying to twist it a little bit and make them look like they're a bunch of dirty devil worshiping. You know what I mean? He's trying to paint them in a certain way.
And also, let's just be real. There have been Christian groups who have, for the sake of carrying out sexual abuse, have done far stranger and worse things than what Epiphanius is describing here. Right. So it's also entirely possible that there was a group of perverts in his church that he ran into, and this is all more or less accurate. However, we do have Gnostic texts from the Nag Hammadi library, like the Paraphrase of Shem, that do seem to be from the tradition about which Epiphanius is talking about. And if we get into it, I think that we can maybe understand a little bit of, from the Gnostic perspective, what's going on here. So, one of the things that we see in the paraphrase of Shem is that the entire world is imagined as this womb created by the false god, by Yaldabaoth, by the Yahweh, Seth, Typhon, deity, creator figure, however you want to say it. And that essentially, so, and this goes back to stuff like the secret book of John, the Apocryphon of John. So, in the Apocryphon of John, one of the key elements of the Gnostic myth is, first, there's the unknowable God. The unknowable God creates a series of divine emanations. The least and less of the divine emanations is wisdom, Sophia. Sophia somehow, and this is sort of in there because it's talking like maybe Sophia is the womb, but also maybe the world is the womb. But what happens in the secret book of John is that Sophia looks around and comes to her own understanding of the divine realm, but it's wrong. But it's also described as her as doing something sexual without her appointed male partner, her counterpart. So because she does some sort of sexually immoral thing and tries to create on her own, misunderstands God, however you want to say it, it creates this lesser deity, Yaldabaoth, who takes on the negative Yahweh, Seth, Typhon characteristics that had been generated 300 years earlier as an anti-Jewish polemic in Egypt and had kind of stayed around in Hellenistic culture as a fairly consistent esoteric idea. So Yaldabaoth, goes off into the darkness, forgets that there was a true divine realm, comes to believe, due to his own brokenness and foolishness, that he himself is the one God. Eventually, Sophia is worried. Sophia goes out into the darkness after Yaldabaoth. Yaldabaoth's created all his bad angels. Yaldabaoth and his angels, especially Samael, fall on Sophia. They hack her into pieces. Then it's those little pieces of Sophia that are sort of built into the physical world that becomes the souls of humanity. And while the Gnostic world is largely unreal, what reality it does have comes from the burying of the fragments of Sophia within the wider world. And so a lot of people don't get this about early Christianity, but there was a lot of belief in reincarnation. Of course, there's resurrection.
Called metempsychosis.
Yeah.
It's a big doctrine. A lot of early Christians held to this doctrine. There's Carpocratians, all these different sects and even the gospel reflects metempsychosis when it implies that John the Baptist is the spirit of Elijah. You can argue that that is some sort of retelling of a metempsychosis occurring.
It's possible. I'd have to look. I don't know as much about John the Baptist literally.
Well, it's not clear that that's what the author meant, but you can certainly make that argument.
Huh, that's fascinating.
You can't say for sure that's what he's saying, but you can't say he's not though. Because it reflects some of these early Christian doctrines of what metempsychosis is.
So one of the early Gnostic ideas, and we definitely see this in the Apocryphon of John, is that we're stuck in this cycle of reincarnation, and the way out of the cycle of reincarnation is the salvation through Jesus, or the gnosis that Jesus brings. Which is
apotheosis, becoming one. It's actually, believe it or not, it might sound crazy to you, but Greek Orthodox Christianity to this day has a doctrine called theosis, and it's attaining oneness with God. It's almost identical to what these Gnostics were talking about, but more on the faith side than on the gnosis side.
I know some Russians who will make a pretty strong differentiation. Like I practice
Fair enough. Of course they would.
I practice hesychasm, the Jesus prayer.
Hesychasm, yeah.
And I did a video on your channel about it once.
Right.
But like, so, and I think one of the big things about practicing meditation is that you're also working on theosis. So these ideas stick around, but there's a very big difference between like a theosis through like adoption by Yahweh versus what these Gnostics are sort of imagining, where you literally have to escape this prison built by the evil angels. So escaping the prison. All right, and this is getting back to the semen eating, which is, I know, what we're all here for tonight. So the idea is that, like, the reproductive capacity of humans, however you want to say it, that is the Sophia piece within us. It's like going out and mixing. And so the way that we're able to create new life through reproduction is by like sharing the Sophia, basically, that inner light, that inner divinity that pre-existed the universe and is now like broken up in chains of physical reality down here. So what the Borborites, and this is gross, but what the Borborites are thinking in the consuming semen and menstrual blood is that, and you can go back to some of the text you show where they're like talking about specifically this being when you see man lifted up, when you see it returned, they are seeing, because they're connected through gnosis to Jesus, they are, by consuming semen and menstrual blood, they are like saving those bits of Sophia, which would otherwise create new lives that would then been trapped within the cycle of reincarnation in the physical world. By consuming that semen and like doing their spiritual stuff, they are like bringing Sophia with them, and thus like helping more Sophia escape reality.
Wow. By the way, Apotheon, thank you for that. Another $50. What is going on with these $50 super chats tonight? Thank you. Hi, Neil. Love that you don't poop on the spiritual side of these. Yeah, of course, of these topics like some of these other atheists. What do you think is going on with texts like Revelation? Are writers like this trying to propagandize, or are they trying to record a crazy drug experience? That is something that I will exactly address in just a moment when I talk about Marcus the Valentinian. That's a good question, but that thank you for that super chat, and it's going to play well into what we're talking about. So yes,
sure. And I think Revelation plays in well here, because it does seem like the book of Revelation is coming out of the late 1st century. It's coming out of the Roman Empire, starting some level of oppression of Christians. And you can see this in like slightly later stuff like Justin Martyr, where there's a big movement within Christianity. Like one way that demographic groups react to oppression is like fighting back and like, oh, we're going to be aggressive. Another way is by like becoming more normative and like fitting into the society better. Like if you read Justin Martyr, a lot of his arguments with pagans are about him arguing that Christianity can be a normative part of Roman imperial culture and that it's all going to be fine. Right. And so, but that also, to like jump to my buddy Carl Jung, he talks about how once you start putting up a mask, that sort of inherently also creates a shadow. Like the mask is everything you want to show to the world, but the shadow is the things you can't. And if they're not well integrated, then the mask can become untenable and the shadow can become like so toxic and weird and abusive.
Isn't that so well said by Jung, by the way?
Yeah. I don't agree with everything he said.
You can't agree with everything Jung, so you'd be crazy if you did that.
But
he was brilliant.
I think, and also what we're seeing here in these Gnostic sects groups is I suspect that when you're trying to put on a very strong face to the world, sometimes that also generates these kind of weird, ugly inner groups like these 80 people who are going around to recruit youths to eat semen with them.
By the way, Carl Jung wrote a lot about these. He was one of the first people to obtain some of the Nag Hammadi scrolls in the 1940s, I think it was. Yeah. So Carl Jung was all over this shit early on, way before anyone else.
Yeah, especially if you read the Gospel of Thomas, like you can see, like, oh, Jung was like heavily going to Thomas for a lot of ideas. But
yeah,
we can get it. That's probably
a whole other topic, right?
That's another video. We're here to talk about the consumption of semen and menstrual blood.
Right.
But yeah, so it's this very weird idea, and like the fetus thing, like that you can tell I'm like creeped out by the eating the. I mean, if they're actually doing this, I mean, gee, that's fucked up. In my opinion,
it really would be. I mean, it's hard to imagine them really doing this, especially on a regular basis for a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe if it happened once and it got, I don't know. How do you even?
Sounds like
how do we find the historical kernel here? That's the question.
Yeah, because they were also talking about eating babies in the Satanic Panic. Eating babies in the Satanic Panic in the 80s, not eating.
Yeah. Is Epiphanius doing another Satanic Panic thing in the 4th century? Is that the thing? Is that what it is? Or is there something in the middle?
Yeah,
are they doing a bunch of weird symbolic shit? You know,
or maybe there's like abusive people within the church because like in the I God help me have read probably more than is healthy about the current Roman Catholic sex abuse crisis, which keeps going. Check out the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tennessee. This week, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tennessee did something very important, and I think we should all praise them. They finally, after they got in trouble for their bishop and the bishop's attorney, like actively disrupting investigations into child sexual abuse that allowed priests to keep hurting kids, they put a rule in the books. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Knoxville, Tennessee will no longer interfere into sex abuse investigations.
Wow, that was a very high bar right there. Let me tell you.
2024, things are looking up. But if you look at these, like, there is a thing where like a number of abuse victims in the Roman Catholic Church in the 20th century say that priests told them that like giving oral sex and consuming the semen was like a form of Eucharist. It's real bad. And it's also possible that these were just like sexually abusive priests and stuff in the 4th century who are sort of dressing it up.
Now, this is probably the best time to bring in Marcus because it shows there's nothing to do with semen. There's not semen in this one, but it seems like there's another charge of abuse happening, not by Epiphanius. This is a little earlier about Hippolytus. By the way, thank you, Myth Vision Podcast. Derek's been a member for 24 months, 2 years. Let's see. When did I start this channel? 3 years ago. So Derek's been here for 2/3 of the time this channel's been around. Thank you, Derek. And I've also been a member of his channel even longer than that. So just, subscribe to Myth Vision Podcast. Everyone here probably already is anyway. But if you're one of those stragglers, go check out Myth Vision Podcast and subscribe. And before I get to this last text, there was one more super chat I just want to catch up on. Dunda Mifflin, thank you for the super chat. How do they come up with the name Sophia? It just means wisdom.
Yeah, it's just wisdom.
Wisdom. And it's there's a beautiful text. It's an Old Testament text from sometime in the Hellenistic age, the Wisdom of Solomon, where it actually describes Sophia as some sort of aspect of God, and it talks about her as a female aspect. It uses the female version Sophia as her. That's what it does. Check out that text. You can see the roots of Gnostic Sophia in that text right there. Constellation Pegasus says the Jews had nasty stuff too. Getting a black kitten and grinding the guts to powder to rub on eyes to see demons. That's new to me. But yeah, I mean, this is just every type of all over the ancient world. You find all types of crazy, interesting ritual things going on. But thanks for that super chat. Now, I wanted to bring in Marcus at this time. This is a perfect time to bring in Marcus because this is what Hippolytus says about Marcus. They call him Marcus Magus, but he's also he's also the disciple of Valentinus. And by the way, his group, this is it. Before I have to preface it with this. Marcus was so important. He's the successor to Valentinus, who was this close to becoming the Bishop of Rome, but lost the vote. He was the number 2 runner-up for Bishop of Rome sometime in the 140s, I think it was. He lost. And his successor, Marcus, who we're about to talk about, started a whole group of Christians called the Marcosians. And they were very Valentinian, Pythagorean, Magi, very Persian influence. But they spread all the way into France. And the Marcosians are actually credited for bringing Christianity into France. That's how widespread they were. They were a big deal in the middle of the 2nd century. But their leader, Marcus, was in trouble. He got charged with, here's what it says, according to Hippolytus. A certain other teacher among them, Marcus, an adept in sorcery, carrying on operations, partly by sleight of hand and partly by demons, deceived many from time to time. This heretic alleged that there resided in him the mightiest power from invisible and unnameable places, and very often taking the cup, as it is offering up the Eucharistic prayer, and belonging to a greater length than usual the word of invocation, he would cause the appearance of a purple. This is a very interesting thing because you see this in the sources a lot, in like the Greek magical papyri, some purple substances. This happens all the time. Anyways, and sometimes of a red mixture, so that his dupes imagine that a certain grace descended and communicated to the potion of blood red potency. The knave, however, at this time succeeded in escaping detection from many, but now, being convicted of the imposture, he will be forced to desist from it. He says he got convicted. I don't know if this is true, but maybe it is. For infusing, this is what his charge was. This is what he got in trouble for. For infusing secretly into the mixture, into the Eucharist, some drug that possessed the power of imparting such a color as that alluded below, the purple, uttering for a considerable time nonsensical expressions. So whatever this drug was, some sort of psychedelic drug, was making them go nuts. They're starting to speak tongues and shit. And then it says he was in the habit of waiting in expectation that the drug, obtaining a supply of moisture, might be dissolved, and being intermingled with the potion, might impart its color to it. The drugs, however, that possess the quality of furnishing this effect, we have previously mentioned in the book on magicians. And here we have taken occasion to explain how they might make dupes of many and thoroughly ruin them. And if it should prove agreeable to them to apply their attention with greater accuracy to the statement made by us, they will become aware of the deceit of Marcus. And just real quick, though, in the next part, it says, Marcus infusing the aforesaid mixture into this is how he did it. He would take the aforesaid mixture into a smaller cup, was in the habit of delivering it to a woman to offer the Eucharistic prayer, while he himself stood by and held in his hand another empty chalice larger than that. He's pulling a magic trick here. And after his female dupe had pronounced the sentence of consecration, having received the cup from her, he proceeded to infuse the psychedelic stuff into its contents into a larger chalice, and then pouring them frequently from one cup to the other, was accustomed at the same time to utter the following invocation: grant that the inconceivable and ineffable grace which existed prior to the universe may fill the inner man, and to abound in the knowledge of this grace, she disseminates the secret mustard tree upon the good soil. And so he would dupe them. He would get them to drink this potion, and apparently they would trip out and see the Holy Spirit and get visions of God. So this is how he was getting people to come to Christ. I don't know, whatever his methods were, whatever his reasons were. This is what he's charged with, according to HELIOPOLIS. I think this is more believable, to be honest. Just me personally.
I mean, I definitely think one thing that you're seeing in both of these is that the Eucharist, as the central ritual of Christianity, has incredible psychological power, spiritual power, however you want to say it. So, in both these cases, the Eucharist is being used as a tool of abuse, or however you want to say it, because it is this like central powerful thing where these people, whether they want to get you high, whether they want to have some sort of sex with you and then get you to participate in like an extreme sex act. But they're not just doing it in the Christian context. They're not just doing it in the Christian community. They are literally attempting to use this moment of the Eucharist to get their way with people. And so I think...
Which is why I thought it was a relevant time to bring it up, because the charges are in common between the two are they're abusing these rights for whatever reasons. That's what they're being charged with. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I don't know enough about Marcus. Does it ever come out like, does he have like a spiritual or mystical agenda beyond getting people high and convincing them that they can see like...
I don't know, but we know that he was a Valentinian who believed in a triad concept of there being God the Father, who they call the nous, the mind, and he has a dyad of Logos and Zoe. This is according to Hippolytus. So there's a triad God, and that's pretty much all we know about the Valentinians from Marcus and Valentinus, and then he goes on to some other heretics after that. But he goes deep into what they believe as far as their theology, and it's very complex, very Platonic and Pythagorean. Like it's got influences of both. Yeah, that's very. They go very much into that. But you're right. I don't know. It doesn't really say what he's trying to do there. What is he? I mean, actually, I think it speaks for itself. If this is true, let's say this really did happen. It looks like what he's trying to do is, as a magician does, you're trying to get people to see the light. You're trying to get them to have an experience that's so awe-inspiring that they will worship God and continue to come to your church, right? That's what I mean. If I had to steel man why someone would do something like that, I mean, it's kind of messed up. You're drugging somebody. That's just straight up wrong. But if I just had to think of why someone would do that, that's the only thing I can think of, right?
Yeah, I mean, and this is just me theorizing wildly. Please, audience at home, I'm sorry I don't have something better to say here. But with the people I've known who've done a lot of psychedelics, I do think you can walk away from that experience feeling like the world isn't quite 100% real.
Right.
People tell
DMT, anybody who's done DMT will say yes. And by the way, that's what they described the Eleusinian mysteries. Whatever the Kaikion was, we don't really know. People have tried to recreate it. Carl Ruck has tried to recreate it. He even admitted to me that he was unsuccessful in his own. He says he doesn't think he was able to do it. He thought it was ergot mixed with some sort of psilocybin and with wine or whatever and beer or something like that. He actually went through a academic setting to try to he took the potion. He said he doesn't think it worked. But anyways, that's what he told me. But whatever they did, whatever the potion, whatever the Kaikion was, all we know from the sources is that people who went through this experience, their lives were transformed. And this is a common thing you hear. They no longer fear death. So if that's what Marcus was doing, I can sort of see what he's trying to do. He's trying to save souls. But let's be real. Drugging people is wrong, obviously.
Drugs, sex, religion, it's all very important to get people's consent.
Yeah, exactly. Let's tell people up front, hey, there's going to be a psychedelic here. So, sign this paper. No, just kidding.
I mean, look, let's try to treat each other well. But I wonder if maybe going back to the Borborites, if like maybe these extreme sort of social convention breaking sex acts, because like even for like temple prostitution in the ancient world, like there's not, it doesn't seem like they were like eating fetuses a lot, but I mean maybe.
There is a story though. You want to hear this?
Sure.
What's his name? Posidonius of Rhodes. That's his name. There's a fragment. This isn't from a text that we have. It's a lost text, but we have a fragment through. Who is it through? I can't remember who it's through. I have the fragment somewhere over here, but there's a fragment. It's in a text called Corey's Ancient Fragments. I think it's called. It's from a Enlightenment writer, English theologian who was just putting together fragments. And there's a fragment about a guy named Posidonius of Rhodes, and he says that there's an island in the Atlantic Ocean occupied by Bacchant Amazonian women, all women, matriarchal society. No men were allowed there. And every year they would go to the mainland and mate with the men and then go back to their island. Now check this. That's how they had their children. That's how they had the next generation. That's how they survived. If the child was male, they would eat the baby in a Bacchic ritual, because you know the story of Dionysus, right?
Yeah.
When Dionysus was first born, Semele is not his first mother. Semele is his second mother. His first birth was through the Corey, Persephone, and he was born as Zagreus. And the Hera, jealousy of Hera, that's what she's known for. She's the rage of Juno, right? She's always raging, right? She sends the Titans because he's the chosen heir of the kingdom of heaven, of Olympus. He's the chosen one. He's going to be, it goes Uranus, Saturn, Zeus, Dionysus. Dionysus is the highest of all the sons of God. So she finds this out and she's like, no, I ain't letting that happen. She sends the Titans and they find the baby Zagreus and they tear him apart and eat him. And then Zeus, and then there's a whole story of his resurrection. And through when Dionysus comes back, Zeus takes the Titans who ate Dionysus. So they have the body of Dionysus in him. By the way, this is very weird because it kind of has to do with kind of sounds like a Eucharist in a way, but let's just hear me out. Zeus kills the Titans and then uses their body to create Earth and humans. So humans, and this is the Orphic theogony, humans are made up of partly Titan flesh and partly Dionysian flesh. And the Dionysian flesh is our good spiritual side, and our Titan side is our evil, wicked side. That's why we have dual nature. That's why our humans are like that. That's how they explain that away. But all right, back to what the story was. These women would eat the boys, and obviously the women would raise them up as Amazonians. They would eat the boys in a Bacchic frenzy and chant Iwa, Iwa, Iwa as they eat the children. That's part of their ritual. So they would eat them. Now, who knows how true the story is, but like, what does it mean? Why would Posidonius say this? Well, it's some sort of Bacchic mythology going on here, right?
Yeah. That's wild. It is, as a story, like, I think, these horror stories, if nothing else, they're very emotionally meaningful. So, like, I don't know. I'm still working to get my hands around exactly what all this means. But I think that it's interesting that, the Eucharist is in and of itself kind of a cannibalism ritual. It's about eating this guy's body and blood. And I don't know if that is, in some cases, leading on and mixing with Hellenistic ideas and leading to more extreme places, or if in some ways, I don't know, why isn't bread and wine enough for people to fulfill their cannibalism fetish? That's what I want to know.
Right.
But yeah.
That's those are sources I brought. I think did you go through all yours too?
Yeah, I mean, there's other stuff I didn't talk about, but
Yeah.
it's more sex and temple prostitution.
There's a lot of that stuff. Yeah, we could go on and on.
There's a lot of temple prostitution out there.
Yeah. Mark Magic Magazine, thank you for the super chat. Says, how much do you feel is metaphor for instances in the PGM or PMG? Invocation to Mars suggests the use of bull semen, and then a few chapters later, we learn it is a plant with a lot of small white. That's a good question. So, is it how much of this is a title for something else? Like the title of bull semen might be just some sort of plant. That's a good question.
That's also a really good thought.
It's a good thing to keep in mind when we're looking through these texts, trying to figure out what's going on. Is it literal or is it a title? That's a good question.
And and whenever you're dealing with Gnosticism, you're fundamentally dealing with people keeping secrets and there being interior and exterior knowledge. I mean, I also just think what's so interesting about the Greek magical papyri is that, the Greek magical papyri are not like the New Testament. There is not a strict canon where there were like councils where a lot of people sat down and said, all right, this material is going to be in the collection of Greek magical papyri, and this material is going to be out of the collection. It's kind of just what we've found. So I think what you have to understand is that every single spell in there, and this is true of a lot of Gnostic groups too, this is just some individual's understanding. Like some of it's tradition, some of it is unique, syncopation, coming up with it as they go. So it's always hard to know. I mean, is there one pure meaning? Do different people, when they read these texts, have different ideas? I don't know. Or, was one day it was bull semen. And then they're like, well, you can also use this flower we call bull semen, so you don't actually, have to do anything gross or dangerous. So who can say? That's a great question.
Yeah. By the way, Epiphanius has such a rich, the stuff that he tells us about these early Christians is so valuable. Like he talks about there being other groups in he describes them being like early on in Egypt and Arabia, where he mentions two gods. One of them is Dusaris. By the way, if you look at the temple in Petra in Arabia, there's Dusaris on the front. He's the main god there. He says that this god was also born by a virgin at the winter solstice, along with another god named Ion from Egypt, who's a synchronization of Adonis and Osiris. So Epiphanius is saying that those two gods had similar rituals or similar stories or birth narratives going on about their being born of a virgin at the winter solstice. Epiphanius tells us this. Did you know that?
I honestly did not. I will look further into that.
I actually have it over here somewhere if you want to look at it real quick. But
sure.
Yeah, let me pull it up actually. So let me see where I know I have it in these notes somewhere. But I've talked about it on my channel a lot. I bring up this topic a lot because like I did a whole video on the Christmas thing. Now this is a late text. So obviously Epiphanius was born in the early 4th century. But here it is actually. I found the text. Wait, is this the that's the Greek. Hold on, no one's gonna be able to read that. But
give him a chance, man.
Right. But go ahead. What were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say, learning Greek ain't easy, but it's super rewarding.
It is. I love it.
One of the great things is once you get in there, a lot of it does make more sense if it's in Greek, because Greek, sometimes it's a little weird to translate, and sometimes it's just very cool to be able to see what it actually says.
Right. It is really cool, actually. Where did I do with that text? Is this it? But yeah, so what else was I going to say? What other texts where we got Hippolytus, we got Epiphanius. Irenaeus is another big one, but he doesn't go as deep as I think as the other one. For some reason, Irenaeus gets the most attraction about.
Well, it's a great name for a book against heresies.
Right, but isn't that the one Hippolytus calls it too? Against heresies? I'm not sure. Maybe not.
I mean, that's a good question. Why is Irenaeus so famous?
I don't know. And then if you look at his version of Against Heresies compared to Hippolytus and Epiphanius, he is nowhere near going as deep as these other two are. Though, like Hippolytus gives us like really good rundowns of what they believed, and like the Nicene preacher, he's got a whole bunch of chapters on the Nicene preacher and all this stuff that they're doing. But Irenaeus is just kind of just like, oh, they all suck. I don't like them. No, that's not it. But you know what I mean. He's very shallow about it.
Explaining the Ogdoad. He's doing his best.
Right.
But I mean, I don't know. I think, I don't know. I guess the big question I'm still sort of working on with all this, and maybe, I don't know. Why is it that religious community, and this is something I've been asking for years. I have a master's of divinity. I've worked specifically on trying to make churches safer. I've specifically tried, but one of the hard realities is there's often abuse in religious spaces. It's not just Christianity. It's not just Judaism and Islam. It happens in Hinduism and Buddhism and many, many, many smaller religions. It is a thing where religion's very powerful. People find mysticism kind of sexy. There's a deep desire for hyper intimate connection. And I don't know, it seems like a lot of weirdos and nerds and so on who have trouble getting the sex they want out in the rest of the world can kind of use their authority or, quote unquote, gnosis or wisdom to try to have the sex they want within the church. But I don't know. It's hard to fully understand what's happening here. I think in some ways religion and the more intense the mysticism, I think it has more in common with drugs than, it's easy to say, oh, religion is the opiate of the masses.
Right.
But I think in a very real way, in the same way that drugs, hey, we get these big endorphin hits. They bring down our boundaries. They help us connect with people. They can be addictive. They can be misused. I think all of that's true for religion also. And so,
sure, absolutely. That's it.
And so, while sometimes there are these specific institutional systems of sex within temples, bang, bang, bang.
Right.
So just think that there is, I don't know, in some ways the conditions are always right for weirdos to try to use religion to get sex. But
exactly. Yeah. It's very free and open. So it's like don't blame religion, blame the people doing the religion. Right. So just like anything else in life, I feel like. But I found the text. So it says, this is from Epiphanius. This is from the same book that we just read from that talks about the Borborites and the semen thing. Same exact book, different chapter, or not, well, different book too, but it's from the same collection of books called the Panarion. This is from book 51. 51. He says, for indeed the Savior was born in the 42nd year of the reign of Augustus, Emperor of the Romans, during his 13th consulship, together with Silanus, as recorded in the Roman consulships. It is stated that during their consulship, the 13th of Octavius and Silanus, Christ was born 8 days before the calends of January, 13 days after the winter solstice, and in the addition of Lightened Day. This day is celebrated by the Greeks, the idolaters, on the 8th day before the calends of January, which the Romans call Saturnalia, the Egyptians call Chronia, and the Alexandrians call Cachelia. For the 8th before the calends of January, this division occurs, which is the solstice, and the day begins to increase as light gains in addition. completing a number of 13 days up to the 8th before the calends of January, each day adding 30 hours up to the day of Christ's birth. As also the wise Ephraim among the Syrians testified to this word in his explanation, saying that thus was ordained the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, the birth according to the flesh, or rather the perfect incarnation, which is called Epiphany. From the beginning of the increase of light for a span of 13 days, for this also had to become a type of our Lord Jesus Christ and his 12 disciples, fulfilling the number of 13 days of increased light. And many other things happened in support of the testimony of this word, that is Christ's birth. It's like, Jesus, get to the point, dude. For even the leaders of the idolatry religion, forced to confess a part of the truth, and to deceive those convinced by them, and idolaters in many places conduct a great festival on the very night of the Epiphany. By the way, just a little side note, Diodorus of Sicily, Pliny the Elder, and Pausanias all talk about this festival happening in Elis on the same night. And there's an epiphany for Dionysus there. There's a whole peer-reviewed article about it from a classicist named Anna Cristobal. She talks about this. Says that they even have a legend on that day for Dionysus turning water into wine. But get this. That's the same day that Christians say that the wedding of Cana happened on. I'm not making this up. All right. Anyways, this is what he says. So that those hoping in the deception would not seek the truth. First in Alexandria, the so-called Corium, by the way, that's the name of, Cori is the name of the mother of Dionysus, the first one. There is a great temple, that is, the precinct of Cori. That's Persephone's title. Or also Isis. She's also called the Cori in the Hellenistic era, because they sync those two goddesses together. For staying awake the entire night with certain songs and flutes, there's the flutes again, there's our flutes, singing to the idol, and spending the whole night after crowing of the roosters, they descend with torches into a certain underground shrine and bring out a certain wooden statue seated on a litter, naked, having a golden seal of a cross on the forehead and the two other such seals in each other's hand, and another two on the knees, together with 5 seals made of gold. They carry this statue around the middle temple 7 times with flutes and drums and hymns. After celebrating, they again bring it down to the underground place. Being asked what this mystery is, they reply and say, this hour today, the Cori, that is the Virgin, gave birth to Ion. This also happens in Petra, the city, the metropolis of Arabia, which is Edom, written in the scriptures. In the idol temple there, they praise the Virgin in Arabic dialect, calling her in Arabic Ka'abu, that is Cori or the Virgin, and the one born from her, Dusaris, that is the only begotten of the Lord. This also takes place in Alusa, the city, on that night, as they're in Petra and in Alexandria. Isn't that wild?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these days on the calendar, like these are big festivals, and
Absolutely.
they kind of get populated with various deities. But like genuinely, like all this stuff about like goddesses, about like Kore,
Fascinating.
this all plays back into these ancient goddess traditions, which are in some ways being expressed within these Gnostic groups. So, like, I think it is no surprise whatsoever that early Christianity mystically plays very, very well with these Hellenistic religions, these polytheisms.
Well, that's what Hippolytus, when he talks about the Nicene preacher, he says that Nicene preacher was a syncretist, that he was syncing Jesus with like Dionysus, Osiris, Attis, Adonis. So I don't know if you've ever heard of this hymn. It's called the hymn. It's called the Homeric Hymn of Attis, and this was an ancient Homeric style hymn, and it's a synchronistic hymn, and it's saying that Attis was called Osiris by the Egyptians. It's called. I actually have it over here somewhere. I have it in my saved file. I always talk about this. That's why I always have it ready. This one. This hymn right here. Blessed one, born of Kronos, Zeus, Rhea, Lalia, Haldi, Attis, The Assyrians call you Adonis. Egypt calls you Osiris. Samothracians Adamus. The Phrygians Papus, of course. Well, this hymn, according to Hippolytus, this was the central hymn to the Nassenes, but they take the name Attis and they replace it with Jesus. So that was happening in these circles. Now, to be fair, though, they're calling these guys heretics. Later in the late second, early third, they're looking back and saying those guys are heretics. But you have to wonder, during the time when these were present, were they heretics in the present time? I don't really know if you can say that. There might have been people who were arguing that they were, but I don't think everybody thought that right away.
Yeah, I mean, obviously everybody didn't think it, or we wouldn't have groups who are using it. So obviously there are some people who think it's working. I don't know. I think to me, it just seems like it took a couple of centuries to kind of work out what was going to be comfortable in, what was like too much paganism, and these sex cults, which it is easy to get like very excited over the semen and menstrual blood eating stuff. But I just got to say, find me a sex cult that does not have weird rituals about bodily fluids. Yeah.
Right.
So how much of it is, well, there's a lot of like sex cults around. And in the same way that you're getting Addis hymns repurposed for Christianity, you're also just kind of getting sex cults repurposed for Christianity, or sex cult practices, however you want to say it. I don't know. It's hard to know exactly where all this stuff is coming from. Like, how much of it's just local perverts, how much of it is like a hard and fast theology, and how much of it is just there is a cultural tradition of like having mystical group sex.
Yeah, and I think the most simple way to explain this is that people are people. And like looking at the PGM, for example, you see a lot of mixing and synchronizations happening. Even today, you have these new age movements that are doing that type of stuff. So there's always going to be a group of purists who are trying to not mix stuff together and trying to keep everything. No, we're pure. No, but there's always going to be those syncretists and new agey types, no matter what time period we're in. You're always going to have both of those.
Totally. I think it's a complex dance of many partners.
Exactly. Well, I'm trying to think of anything else. I don't got anything else. Do you?
I think not. I have got to get up and go to actual church in the morning.
Nice. Nice. Funny. All right. Well, links for you. I have a link for your X in the description if they want to follow you on X.
Totally.
Check out your stuff there. And that's pretty much all you want to present. Everything else coming up?
I'm working on research. Oh, I found something fun. Here's just a little, can I give a little preview for the next?
Yeah, do what you got to do.
Yep. So, I am working as the weird sex stuff, women's leadership is often pushed into Gnosticism, where it seems to have been a little more abundant in early Christianity. One of the ideas that I'm really interested in looking at is how economic ideas, like some of Jesus's more extreme, like you should live in intentional poverty and give away all your stuff. I found a really good example of this, and I'm looking for others. But if you look at Gospel of Thomas, I think verse 64, there is some, so, in the Gospel of Luke, it says, blessed are the poor. But in the Gospel of Matthew, it says, blessed are the poor in spirit, which is a little weaker or softened maybe. Well, there's also in the Gospel of Matthew, there's this parable where there's a rich man who is throwing like a wedding feast for his daughter, sends out servants to all these other rich men. One of them says, oh, I'm buying a field. One of them says, oh, I'm, giving a loan. Another one says, oh, I'm, doing another thing. I'm just too busy. So the rich man then says, well, send the servants out into the gutters, into the alleyways, bring in all the poor, good and ungood for the party. And then there's this weird shift in tone where the rich man then sees someone who isn't dressed appropriately for the wedding and has him thrown out. Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it's like, well, everybody's loved, but you got to be ready or something. Well, in the Gospel of Thomas, that story, it's in, I think, verse 64 of Gospel of Thomas. If I get it wrong, please forgive me. This is just a preview. It'll be good.
Right.
Jesus has that same story. Rich man throwing a wedding feast. One guy's buying a field. One guy's making a loan. One guy's, doing something like that. And then the rich man invites all the people into the house. And instead of shifting into that second narrative about the person not being dressed correctly, Jesus just says, and therefore businessmen and merchants will not enter my Father's kingdom. And so I think that there's a possibility that one of the things we're seeing in the shift from Q to Matthew, in the same way that we see that shift from blessed are the poor to blessed are the poor in spirit, I think that there is maybe a softening of Jesus's teaching that businessmen and merchants will not enter the kingdom of heaven, which I think we can both say hearing that's a pretty intense Jesus teaching, which also just kind of sound like something Jesus would say.
Yeah.
So I'm looking. So what I want to do for the next lecture is I want to just talk about economics and poverty as discussed in early Gnostic texts, and whether or not Jesus was actually cool with businessmen and merchants. So that's next time on Vivian Taylor being a guest on Gnostic Informant.
That's a good idea. Because how cynic was Jesus?
Exactly.
We'll get into that stuff. That's a really interesting topic. And with that being said, you have just attained true gnosis.
You have